Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other topics, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Have I Got News for You is back for another season. Roy Wood Jr., Amber Ruffin, and Michael Ian Black are finding the funny in the week's biggest stories. Have I Got News for You returns Saturday at 9 on CNN and stream next day on Max.
I have a bit of a weird job for several reasons, but for one, many of my colleagues' varied ideological commitments are pretty clear due to the nature of our work. But I was curious about what workplaces look like in less overtly political places. Do people often know the political opinions of their colleagues and bosses? Could work be a place for the healthy mixing of people with different partisan identities? Probably not. At least, that's what I take away from a new paper called Political Sorting in the U.S. Labor Market, which argues that political segregation is extremely common in the workplace. According to the authors, a Democrat or Republican's coworker is 10% more likely to share their party than what you might expect based on where their workplace is located. Why? Well, it's largely because workers are opting into college majors, jobs, industries, and companies that correspond with their partisan identities. Republicans are more likely to have studied business, finance, engineering, and technology, while Democrats are more likely to have studied the arts, social sciences, and the humanities. Industries themselves are therefore more likely to have employees of one party rather than the other. But even within industries, companies are attracting one party's adherents over the other. My name's Jerusalem Demsis. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic, and this is Good on Paper, a policy show that questions what we really know about popular narratives. My guest today is Sahil Chinoy, who co-authored this paper while finishing up his economics PhD at Harvard. Sahil himself is on the job market. I'm sure headed to one of those ideologically diverse workplaces so common in academia. Sahil, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So before you conducted your research project, did you think that workplaces were more or less segregated than other areas of life, like, I don't know, neighborhoods, schools, etc.?
Yeah, I think somewhat less. I think I was sort of, I had heard, like we've all heard this idea that there should be, quote, no politics at work. And I think I, took that to heart and thought the workplace might be a site and kind of like a unique, uniquely important site where there's less partisan or political segregation than some of the environments the other environments that we inhabit, schools and certainly neighborhoods. There's sort of a lot of attention paid to partisan segregation, particularly across space, across neighborhoods. And I do think that I thought that the workplace would exhibit less sorting than that. How much less, I don't know. I certainly thought that it can't be the case that it's perfectly even, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when you're young and you're in like K-12 or something, it's like the time of your life when you're repeatedly kind of interacting with people that you didn't choose to be interacting with. It's your teachers, other kids at school. And when you grow up, it's like work is basically one of the only times when you're being forced to go anywhere that you're not actively choosing who you're going to be interacting with. Like, obviously, there's like tons of segregation that comes from where people are in school. But I think the fact that like this is arguably the only place that adults are interacting with people that they're not opting into on a regular basis, that like leads people to kind of feel like, oh, this is probably like the most generative space for reaching people across the partisan aisle, but you did not find this. So walk me through your paper. What did you do to investigate whether workplaces were segregated by party?
Yeah, so just one point on that. I think that's exactly right. I think the idea here is like people have less ability to choose who their coworkers are compared to other, people that they interact with, and that's what generates segregation. I will note, though, that it's kind of funny when I bring this point up to academics and to professors, they're sort of the one group, I think, that doesn't really see this. They're like, what do you mean? Like, we can perfectly choose who our colleagues are. That's what
in fact like the
hiring
whole
is.
point.
That's the whole point. But I think generally, yes, I think that's the idea. So we're sort of starting with this basic premise that, maybe the workplace is less segregated, politically segregated than some of these other environments. Not such a hard question to pose or to ask, I think. It's just a hard question to answer. And it's a hard question to answer, I think, primarily because of a data constraint. We have very high quality and large labor market surveys in the US, but they don't ask questions about politics or partisan affiliation. And we have large and high-quality political surveys, but they usually don't ask questions about where exactly people work. And even if they did, they're large, but they're not large enough to really capture who is working with whom. And so, the starting point of this paper is really say we have this pretty, to some extent, obvious question, to what extent do Democrats work with Democrats and Republicans work with Republicans? And how are we going to answer it? And the way we answer it is by combining two sources of information. On the one hand, like public LinkedIn profiles, so scraped LinkedIn profiles that list where everyone works and some other characteristics about them, like often where they went to college or their educational background. And we combine that with administrative voter records. And so in the US, who you vote for is not public, but in 30 states and the District of Columbia, which party you register with is public. Mm-hmm. And so we combine those two sources of information, and that lets us see who is working with whom and everyone's party affiliation. And that's how we can quantify the magnitude of this partisan segregation at work.
So you find that a Democrat or Republican's coworker is 10% more likely to share their party than expected based on local partisan shares. Can you just unpack that finding? What does that mean?
Yeah, so the idea is we want to benchmark the share of your coworkers who are who share your party affiliation against what we might expect. And so, to give you a concrete example, say you are a Democrat and you work at Google in Mountain View, then a high share of your coworkers are fellow Democrats. I think it's something like 55% in our data. Mm-hmm. And so that's a relatively high share of Democrats. But what should we actually expect? Should we benchmark that against the share of Democrats in the U.S. as a whole? Mm. And so our baseline measure takes that sort of realized share of co-partisans, so the 55% of Democrats that share your workplace, and divides it by the share of Democrats in your local labor market, which we operationalize as a commuting zone. Commuting zones are sort of aggregations of counties that are precisely designed to capture these kinds of commuting patterns, who could reasonably share your workplace. And it turns out, I'm going to forget the exact number, but it turns out that share is quite high, for Google and Mountain View. So you're a Democrat, Google, Mountain View, your coworkers are 6% more likely to share your party affiliation than you would expect based on the local shares of Democrats and Republicans. And then we generalize that for, everyone. We do that for every person in our sample, tens of millions of people. And that's how we arrive at that 10% number.
This is, I think, a really great way of putting it because, obviously someone's going to say, okay, Google, you're in California, you're in Silicon Valley, this is just a high Democrat place. So are you just, looking at basically that there is geolocation sorting that's already happening? And you're saying, it's not just the fact that, there are locational differences in partisanship. It's that even taking that into account, workplaces are even more segregated based on party than you would expect just by, walking around and taking a random sampling of people who live in the commuting zone that Google is in.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, I can compare against the national shares. And if I do that, that number is 20%. It's twice as high as sort of the baseline statistic that I quoted for you earlier. And that's a meaningful number too. But we think that, what sort of intuitively accords with people's sense of how to measure partisan segregation, it's probably comparing against the local environment. And that's why that 10% number is kind of our preferred estimate.
How does this compare to the level of partisan segregation that we observe in other places? We know, for instance, that there's partisan segregation happening in schools or in dating markets and churches and stuff like that. Is the workplace the most segregated based on party in America, or is this in line with other places?
Yeah. So It's hard to answer this directly for every other social environment or every other group of people. I can tell you a couple things. So one is I think a natural comparison is residential partisan segregation. This is something that people study a lot, right? The extent to which Democrats live on the same block as Democrats and Republicans live next to other Republicans. And so we can sort of compare what I told you, that 10% number, that overexposure ratio, against partisan segregation across neighborhoods. And you can define neighborhoods in different ways. One way to do it is a zip code. And when we do that, we find that partisan segregation at work is pretty similar. So like a little bit less than, but overall pretty similar to partisan segregation across zip codes. We can go one step further and say, maybe the zip code is a little bit bigger than what you have in mind when you think of neighborhood level sorting. And so we have individuals addresses in our data. And so we can say, you have 15 coworkers. Let me figure out how many of them share your party affiliation. And then let me look in our sample at the 15 people who live closest to you and figure out how many of those people share your party affiliation. And when we do that, we find that workplace level segregation, the overexposure ratio is a little bit less pronounced than that sort of nearest neighbor level of segregation, but still pretty similar. Not so different. It's not orders of magnitude different. So that's kind of why we say that it's a little less pronounced than residential segregation as a whole, but still pretty sizable. This isn't in the paper, but we can also look at colleges. That's the other thing that we can really observe, well in our sample. And when we do that, we find that colleges are less segregated along party lines than our workplaces. A lot of that is because, that's college cohorts. So people in
Wait,
your...
sorry. Can you break that down? College cohort, you mean like the people who went to your college and then our class of 2017 as well?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, so that group, the people who went to my college and are in the same class as me, are less segregated than my workplace.
Yeah. And
maybe not me in particular, but like on average.
I think a lot of that is just the size of these groups, right? College cohorts are quite big compared to workplaces, which tend to be relatively smaller. And so there's a little bit more room for that kind of political diversity in college cohorts. And so, I don't know. You can so to the extent to which you think that's an apples to apples comparison, I think is up for debate because of that size issue. But yeah.
So you're not going to take like the hard position that colleges are more open than workplaces in America.
I wouldn't say they're more open, but certainly you're in this group of people that, for many people, is like quite large and might include people from diverse geographic backgrounds. That's also something that happens at colleges. So yeah.
So is this a function of income or racial or gender segregation? Like how much of this can be explained by the fact that our workplaces are segregated by factors that are correlating with partisanship but are not partisanship in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a natural question. I think it is important to note, though, that overall, like, what is the phenomenon of interest? It's partisan segregation without sort of differencing out all of those other background characteristics, right? And I think that kind of there's an analogy to gender segregation at work. To what extent is gender segregation at work driven by different occupational choices, the different occupations that men and women sort into or are sorted into? That's sort of an interesting question. At the end of the day, that's part of the phenomenon of interest. That's part of what creates segregation at work. And so I think a similar thing applies here. That said, we can do, I think, the kinds of exercises you have in mind, where instead of benchmarking just against the share of Democrats and Republicans in your local labor market area, in your commuting zone, we can additionally incorporate information about those coworkers in predicting their partisanship. And so what I mean is, like, if we knew not just where your coworkers lived in terms of which commuting zone they live in, but also their exact year of birth and their gender and their race, things which are, as you know, are very correlated with partisanship in politics in the U.S., would we still be surprised that Democrats disproportionately work with Democrats and Republicans disproportionately work with Republicans? So these are pretty fine predictors, right? We actually interact year of birth and gender and race. So for me, Asian male born in 1995 tends to be registered with the Democratic Party at a particular rate. We can incorporate that information and say, is it still the case that we see this partisan sorting? And we find that indeed, that explains some segregation, but certainly not all of it. And we can add, even more predictors. So not just the education level of everyone, whether they went to high school or college or have a postgraduate degree, again, something that's highly correlated with partisanship, but also the exact college that they went to. And we can show there are partisan differences across schools, and we can incorporate that information as well. We can incorporate not just the exact college that you went to, but what you studied when you were there. And there, again, we see large gaps in the college major choices of Democrats and Republicans, which I think actually is independently quite interesting also. So college and major, and then industry and occupation. We can incorporate all of these predictors, and we still find that a Democrat or Republican's coworker is about 4.3% more likely to share their partisanship than we would expect. So we bring that ratio down from 10% to 4.3%. All of these things clearly matter, but they don't explain all of the segregation that we see.
I also want to ask you though. I mean, so I think that's like really significant. I think my when I first saw your abstract, I was kind of like, okay, well, is this just like, Black people are Democrats and, women are Democrats and, men are Republicans, like when we're looking at averages and seeing that significant difference even without that. And I mean, I take your point well that like looking at the partisanship is relevant, even if it is the case that like race and gender are playing into that, like that like overall partisanship still tells you something about workplaces in America. But I also want to ask, because I think in your paper that you're seeing more heterogeneity for different income bands and educational attainment, that there's a different level of partisan segregation for people who make more money or for people who have, graduate degrees or college degrees. Can you tell me about that? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. We can, the 10% number that I was quoting for you before is an average across everyone in our sample. We can see what that looks like among subgroups. And in particular, we can see what that looks like among subgroups defined by education and by income. When we do that for education, we see something pop there, which is the people with postgraduate degrees, people who are more highly educated, tend to be in workplaces that are more segregated. And there's a little bit of something going on for high school graduates versus people with bachelor's degrees, but really where it tends to stand out the most is people with a postgraduate education. And that pattern seems...
It's you, Sahil. You're causing all our problems.
I mean, yeah, like kind of though, right? And like you can think of stories why this might make sense. Maybe these people have more of an ability to choose an employer that really aligns with their ideological interests in a way that isn't true for other groups of workers. I can't say for sure why.
Or they're more motivated, right? Like you might be more ideological or partisan.
Totally.
Yeah.
Also true. And actually on that point, when we subset to people who have made campaign contributions and, are more might be more politically motivated or politically interested, kind of in the way you were describing, we also see that those people are experiencing more segregation at work, particularly the people who donate to very liberal or very conservative candidates. And then you also asked about income. And here we see a little bit less of a clear pattern, actually. So the gradient seems more pronounced for education than for income. There's a bit of a technical point here, which is that we don't know someone's exact income in the LinkedIn data. You don't put that on your LinkedIn profile mostly, but so we infer it from where people live based on the block group that they live on. And so you might worry that that's sort of an inexact measure of income, but the education measure we have is more specific. We try to do some things to alleviate that concern. Overall, it looks like we still sort of stand by the idea that the gradient is stronger for education than for income.
But for income, higher income people are more likely to have a more segregated workplace?
Barely among our sample. And our sample is people who have LinkedIn profiles. And so that's a higher education or higher income slice of the population than the overall workforce. And among that sample, we don't see too much in terms of the highest income people among them experiencing more segregation than the lowest income people.
And this is a bit like a field from your specific paper, but I remember there being like a lot of talk about how diverse workplaces were more creative, and I think that literature is actually kind of more mixed. So don't quote me on how I don't know how good that literature actually stands up, but there's a lot of talk about like having kind of ideological diversity, like background diversity, et cetera, can make for more creative teams. Does your research look at whether these sorts of workplaces are have any impact on productivity? Do you have like thoughts on whether that would be play out given like other research you've looked at?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's the next paper I want to write.
Yeah.
Certainly there are countervailing forces here. It's probably bad for, workplaces to have 100% people who think a certain way. That seems not optimal. It also seems like you probably want to be able to get along with your coworkers to some extent. And if partisanship and political affiliation is a measure of that, then you probably, a little bit of homophily might actually be productive. So my speculation is that there would be a bit of a U-shape there. I don't know for sure. I think that would be super interesting to study. I think that where people do study this question specifically is among corporate leaders. It's been historically a little bit easier to get information about the political affiliation and donation behavior of executives and board members. And so people have focused on that. There is one paper that looks at, they basically claim that increasing political polarization of corporate America is not in the financial interest of shareholders. I'd have to remember exactly what they study in that paper, but I think they're looking at like the alignment between corporate executives and their boards, the political alignment, and looking at what happens when they leave.
Yeah, we can put that paper in show notes for people to take a look at if they want. There's another paper, also we'll put that in show notes, from Christopher Rosen in last January. And they found that like employees experience negative affect after overhearing political conversations at work. Essentially, like the effects are amplified when employees seem that like the coworkers are less similar to them. So it's like you're more negative when you're like, oh, you overhear someone who's a Democrat and you're a Republican having kind of a conversation and they're attenuated when you overhear someone who is basically has your viewpoints or you feel like it's aligns with your ideological or partisan goals. And so, I mean, like that seems like pretty straightforward there. And I agree, like these countervailing forces here feel like difficult to like sort out, particularly because like an individual firm's goal might be to increase the amount of, good feelings that people within their company feel. But like an industry or like our goal as like a society or to try to create most productive companies might be to have a lot more frictions happening in the workplace, for the societal benefits that might bring. So like, it's also like the incentives are also countervailing here. Like there's not really an incentive from like workplace leadership maybe to try and make their workplaces more diverse in ideology, which I feel like is why there was such a push to try to find productivity benefits from kind of ideological diversity to try to incentivize this kind of corporate shift. But I don't know, it seems rough.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think the other thing I would add is that the conversation we just had is kind of focused on the interests and the efficiency of and productivity of companies and workers. There's also like we might have like a social interest in partisan mixing and people, who don't think the same way politically interacting with each other. Again, this is the kind of thing that I think is like on its face seems right. Like we probably want people to, interact with people who don't think like them. Yeah. Actually saying why that is good politically is not terribly obvious. Like, is it going to reduce, support for, political violence or things like that? Probably not. I think people have shown that people don't generally believe in that kind of thing anyways. But, the extent to which I think mixing between Democrats and Republicans is good for our politics. I think that's sort of another reason to be interested in this issue.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to emphasize for listeners, I know, Sahil, you haven't said this, but it's not, we're not saying that like all these workplaces, and you're not finding that all these workplaces are 100% Democrat or 100% Republican. It's that like, it's just more likely to be. And so, I mean, people might look around and say like, I know the conservative at my job, and it's like, yeah, the conservative at your job. Yeah. So I think though that what you just said kind of segues into another finding in your paper, which is that there's like a persuasive aspect to this too. Like, I guess like just to like tell you my prior, like I feel like if I was constantly surrounded by, very right-wing people at my job, I would probably only become more left-wing. But I do think that like maybe your paper indicates that that is not the that effect is not the same for everyone. Or maybe I'm just wrong about myself. Maybe I would be persuaded. But tell me about that finding. What did you see?
Yeah, so the story there is mixed. I don't think it's going to be. I don't think what you're saying is wrong about yourself. I think so. Yeah. So the idea here is, what could explain segregation, political segregation? Well, one channel that could explain political segregation is sort of this conformity effect. People become like their coworkers, like their workplace over time. If I end up in a workplace with a lot of Democrats, I might be more likely to affiliate with the Democratic Party, and sort of vice versa. For Republicans, this has been shown actually with neighborhoods, and so people tend to adopt to some extent the partisanship of their neighbors or the people that they live around. And so we were interested in whether something similar could be happening at work. I'll spare you the details of exactly how we estimate this, unless you want me to get into it.
No, please.
But the basic finding is that we find that the workplace can causally affect people's partisan affiliation, but only for people who don't start out as like committed Democrats or Republicans. And so you're not really getting people to change their mind. I think that's kind of consistent with perhaps the story that you were telling about yourself. But people who start out as either independents or who start out as not registered with a particular political party, we find that moving to a workplace with, where the coworkers are more Democratic or more Republican tends to make those individuals more Democratic or more Republican on average. So there is some evidence of a little bit of an effect of the workplace on individuals' partisan politics or party affiliation. It's not as big as in the case of neighborhoods, and so it seems like this channel has less power to explain the segregation that we see. And in particular, it looks like the timing of this is kind of interesting. It looks less the case that people switch to a new workplace and then adopt the politics of that workplace, and rather the case that people update their own party registration and then move to a sort of compatible workplace, a co-partisan workplace.
Interesting.
And that's what kind of leads us to think maybe it's less the case that people are picking up the politics of their workplace, and more the case that people are selecting jobs or workplaces in part based on politics or things correlated with their own party affiliation. And that's sort of that's the direction that we go in the paper.
After the break, how firms use partisan language to appeal to Democratic versus Republican job seekers.
You found your person. Now let the Knot help you with everything else. The Knot connects you to the wedding inspo, vendors, venues, and planning tools you need to make your day totally you. Having helped plan 25 million weddings, we've got your back when it comes to every little detail like RSVPs, budgets, and more. Because your wedding comes to life with the connections that matter the most. Get started at theknot.com/audio. The Knot. Let's plan your wedding together.
What is driving this, I think, is a very useful thing to spend some time on now. I mean, I guess I could theorize a bunch of different streams by which partisan sorting shows up, like word of mouth and recommendations, or might be driven through partisan networks, or Democrats are more likely to be academics and Republicans are more likely to be petroleum engineers or business owners or whatever. And when you're able to kind of drill down into how people are sorting, what part of the employment timeline is this actually coming up in?
Yeah, that's right. So it's not a straightforward answer in the sense that certainly it's the case that we can see in our data that Democrats and Republicans are choosing different schools and majors and occupations and industries. And so, clearly all of that matters. It sort of limits the available workplaces and the kinds of people that you could even, possibly interact with at work. That is something we can account for statistically when we measure segregation. That's, I kind of described how we did that earlier, and we sort of still find that there's residual segregation. So what's explaining that residual? There are a couple of different ideas. And I think the two probably main ones are, it's workers selecting partisan or compatible workplaces, or it's some kind of employer discrimination channel. Employers are hiring people of a particular party or want things correlated with a particular partisan identity. And we focus on worker selection in this paper, I think kind of for the reason that I mentioned, that sort of suggestive timing of when people are moving to co-partisan workplaces after sort of updating their party registration. And we focus on the worker selection channel, and we try to say, is it the case that workers are actually selecting jobs based on something related to their political identity and something related to how they perceive the politics of the company? We do this in a survey, and the sort of the key question, I think, to begin studying this is, what do workers actually know about a company when they choose whether or not to apply for a job there? It could be the case that segregation is driven because Democrats, want to work at companies with more Democrats. But is that something you really know when you apply for a job? You don't know that it's 60% Democrats versus 40 or something like that. And so to study this, we kind of look at our big data set that we've assembled of all these companies and how many the shares of Democrats and Republicans who actually work there. And we look at how these companies are signaling. We look at the language that they use to describe themselves, and we see how that correlates with partisanship, with the shares of Democrats and Republicans who are actually at that company. And we actually find, that there's quite a bit of signal here, that the Democratic companies are advertising themselves in a way that's quite different than the Republican companies, even within the same industry. And a lot of that probably, a lot of the actual signaling language probably won't surprise you. It's words related to the environment and diversity and community for the Democratic companies, and sort of the absence of those for the Republican companies. But the fact that these signals kind of come through so clearly in our data kind of leads us to study the extent to which this can drive sorting. And I'll pause there for a second, but I can tell you how we study that.
Can you? Yeah. I would like you to talk more about that, because I saw the ideological signals in company descriptions, and this is on LinkedIn, right? So how are Democratic firms versus Republican firms describing themselves?
Yes, exactly. So again, I want to emphasize this is all sort of within industry. So we're not just comparing, nonprofits, which tend to have more Democratic employees, to say, energy companies or oil and gas firms, which tend to have more Republican employees. This is saying, take two firms within the same industry, look at the text that they use, the words that they use on LinkedIn to describe themselves, and those are sort of the, we find empirically that there's these words that are quite correlated with the partisanship of the employees. And again, it's, I think, a lot of the kind of bundle of things related to ESG practices and things related to diversity initiatives, and things that, are related to more subtle, perhaps, things about, we're a company that really emphasizes community and sort of teamwork among our coworkers versus that tends to be empirically more democratic, versus we're a company that really emphasizes customer service and efficiency and excellence. That tends to actually be more correlated with companies that have more Republicans, which maybe wasn't necessarily obvious to me.
Yeah. I saw this other paper come out recently by Erica Kurgios, hopefully I'm saying that right, and her co-authors, that looks at whether communicating diversity goals, measurable diversity goals, attracts or repels historically marginalized job applicants. It's a bit orthogonal to the broader conversation, but I think it plays into this part of your paper quite well. They look at whether adding a measurable goal to a public diversity commitment, instead of, quote, we care about diversity, you might say, we care about diversity and plan to hire at least one woman or racial minority for every white man we hire. And they look at whether that impacts application rates from women and racial minorities. They find that it increases application likelihood among those groups by 6.5% without sacrificing candidate quality. But interestingly, it's mostly driven by white women. I'm not even sure that the racial minority finding is statistically significant, though they do find that it's positive. And I think about this in relation here, whether there are different subgroups that are more motivated to find a job that is more partisan, with more of their co-partisans at work, and how that changes with racial and gender different subgroups. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that there's sort of a lot of interesting work studying how these kinds of job ads affect who applies. The other big one, I think, is, again, like I alluded to before, ESG practices. And there's another case, I think, where you can think of ways to make that verifiable, or you can take, you can say that this company has some particular ESG designation. And I think what is maybe interesting about our survey or in our paper is that we actually aren't signaling anything that is explicitly verifiable. There's no stamp associated with, with a company that is more pro-democratic or more pro-Republican.
Yeah.
And yet this sort of matters. And yet job seekers clearly seem to pick up on these things and care about them.
I think someone listening to this might feel like, okay, is this just like a function of like this current moment right now? Like overt partisan politics of the workplace is like much more commonplace in recent years. And I mean, like what you said, this prevailing or narrative about like, politics shouldn't be discussed at work, like politics, religion, you know what I mean? Leave that outside the workplace. Like that's kind of like a more older view of the workplace. When exactly were you conducting this? And do you have any sense of like whether or not like this is just like a 2017, 2022 moment?
Yeah, it's a great question. So to answer the question, our LinkedIn data is a snapshot from 2022. And our voter file data, which we're kind of using to track how people's party affiliation changes as they move from workplace to workplace, starts in 2012. And so it's covering a more recent time period for sure. The question of can we measure how this is changing over time, I think is super interesting and a little bit hard in the sense that, you can see, in our LinkedIn data, where was everyone working in 2010, but then you worry who are the kinds of people who have actually gone through and listed where they work in 2010. And so you worry about selection. And so I find that kind of a hard question to answer. I think that there's suggestive stuff. So, you ask people in surveys if they're willing to, leave a job over political differences, you'll find that it's the case that young people are much more likely to say that. Now, was that true in 1962? I'm not quite sure. But that sort of points in that direction. You find that in other countries, in Brazil, for example, that this kind of political assortative matching has been increasing over time. You find that among corporate boards, again, this kind of thing has been increasing over time. And so I think there are a lot of sort of suggestive indications that this might be something that is more pronounced today than it was a couple of decades ago. It's really hard to say for sure, though.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, too, because, I mean, part of what's happened over this time period, at least in the United States, is that our parties have become much more sorted on ideology. And so, in the 1950s or whatever, there were a lot more conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. And that has changed significantly over time. And now that there are, most people who are ideologically liberal have sorted into the Democratic Party. So it becomes kind of difficult to measure this if you're looking at just partisan measurements. Like, maybe there was more partisan diversity at workplaces in 1962, but ideological diversity was still really low, and there were people who were still sorting. So I think there's quite a difficulty with measurement there.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's a good point. I think it makes me sort of think of one other point, which is that for a smaller set of our sample, about 10% of our sample, we can measure their donation behavior.
Oh, cool.
And so there we can actually look at sort of a within-party measure of sorting. We can say, is it the case that the more liberal Democrats, as measured by who they're actually donating to, are sorting into workplaces with more Democrats, and vice versa for Republicans. And there we also find, pretty strong patterns. So there is an extent to which this exists even within party.
Another question I have is about obviously 2022, pretty tight labor market. So workers have tons of choice and ability to kind of sort based on a bunch of different amenities. And I wonder if you think that this kind of sorting happens less in a high unemployment environment. So, God forbid, I mean, when there's a recession or at some point, or there's a period of high unemployment, do you expect kind of this kind of ideological sorting to go down?
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes. And I think that, again, that would be a pretty cool follow-up paper. I think that's something that we can probably study directly in the data that we have. I think, yes. And so I think that one sort of, piece of evidence here is, how important are these kinds of what we call, quote, ideological amenities or partisan amenities? How much are these characteristics about a job? How much do workers value them relative to other things that they might care about in a job? Our survey is designed to precisely measure the quantitative trade-offs people would make for these kinds of ideological amenities in relation, trading off against wages. It turns out to be about 3% of their salary.
It's wild.
Is that big or small? I think it depends on your priors, but it's certainly way smaller than what people would pay for healthcare, or some of these sort of more.
How do you measure that? How do you know someone's willing to trade 3% of their salary?
Yeah, so this is the survey, and this is kind of what I was getting at before, where we pick up these ideological signals in the way these companies describe themselves. Mm-hmm. We use them to generate synthetic job ads, which we want to do this we want to ask workers in a wide range of occupations and industries about these different kinds of jobs. How do we do that without me sitting down and writing, 10,000 job ads? This turns out to be exactly the kind of thing that ChatGPT is good at. A large language model is good at. We can give it these kinds of ideological signals that, we find in our data are correlated with companies with more Democrats and Republicans. We can give it a particular occupation and industry, and it'll come back with a job ad that sort of does emphasize these signals or doesn't emphasize these signals. And then we ask workers about them in an online survey. We ask them to explicitly sort of make choices between these companies that are framed in different ways, and we vary the wages associated with these job ads. And that's how we can sort of capture the strength of this trade-off. And so that's how, that's where we sort of get this 3% number. Is it big or small? It's less than something like healthcare. It's sort of actually comparable in magnitude to some of these, I guess you could call them like softer amenities, things like having a relaxed versus a fast pace of work, for example, or having training opportunities at work. People seem to care similarly about the ideological nature of the job, similar to those other characteristics. Of course, the difference is that our ideological amenities are precisely designed to split Democrats and Republicans. Democrats care about the liberal one, and Republicans care about the other one. Whereas Democrats and Republicans care similarly about, say, a relaxed pace of work. And so those other amenities can't generate segregation. The stuff that we study and design actually can generate segregation.
I guess, I'm not surprised that people would, trade off a little bit on wages in order to, feel more comfortable at work with their ideological co-partisans. I wonder if, you were to tell people, hey, your revealed preference is that you would sacrifice, X $1,000 a year. Do you actually want to take that trade? It's different, with remote work, for instance, they're doing these experiments now where people are I will, genuinely, take a pay cut in order to be able to be fully remote. I wonder if people would explicitly say, yes, in order to be at a more Republican firm, I will give you $3,000. And I wonder if that's a self-conception problem that we might run into if you made that explicit.
Yeah, so certainly we're asking people in the survey to kind of make these trade-offs explicitly. It's job A or job B, and it's $3,000 or not. I will say also that in the observational data, we don't know individuals' wages directly. Again, that's the problem I mentioned. People don't list their salary in their LinkedIn profile. But we do know something about where they live and their occupation and their industry. We know what college they went to. And so we can take similar Democrats and Republicans, similar in terms of their demographics and where they live, and in terms of what exact college that they went to, which is a pretty good measure of of education or perhaps labor market skills, and find that the Democrats are consistently choosing occupations and industries that pay less than the Republicans. And so, there's certainly some evidence or some suggestive evidence that there's some trade-off that people are making between fit with the workplace or with their job more generally and the actual salary associated with that job.
I looked at, there's a Gallup polling in February of last year that asked about U.S. employees' experience with political conversations at work. And, conservatives were much more likely to say that they had a discussion with coworkers about politics. 60% of conservatives versus 48% of liberals. That is, I think, contrary to at least my expectations. I'd expect parity or maybe liberals would be doing it more. I don't know why I had that expectation, but I was surprised. And I don't know, it makes me think that maybe there's some sort of mobilization aspect happening here. If conservatives are, saying in 2024 that they're having conversations with coworkers about politics, and then all of a sudden conservatives win a trifecta. I don't know if that's playing into it.
Yeah, that's interesting. That probably goes against my priors a little bit too. I think I would have expected liberals or Democrats to be having more of these conversations at work. That's interesting. So yeah, I think that certainly studying mobilization, if you're sort of, it's actually not clear to me, right? If you're part of the majority group at your workplace, and then everyone's like, hey, let's go vote for our candidate, is that actually going to make you more likely to turn out? Or is there some sort of backlash effect if you're a minority and you say, I really hate all these conversations I'm having with my coworkers, I'm going to go, try to vote them out of office or something like that.
Yeah.
It's not super clear to me what direction that goes in. I think that it is a great question.
I'm like
to
revealing
study.
a lot about my psychology in this episode, going like, well, if I had like a 60% people who disagreed with me, then I'm just like definitely going to go vote, So
Right.
maybe that's not the average experience for people.
Well, to tie this back to, again, I think we find these like pretty heterogeneous effects on partisanship for people who start out as committed versus not. And so I think there's some sense in which maybe people who are younger and who are susceptible to political influence might, adopt the politics of their workplace and perhaps turn out. And then people who, already have a particular ideological stance or particular partisan attachment might be sort of motivated to turn out as sort of like a backlash or, against the prevailing politics of the workplace. I'm not sure. I think that's an interesting question.
So we mentioned a couple times, I mean, you're on the job market right now. You've mentioned academia a bit. I mean, have you seen any of this playing out in your own field, like this kind of sorting?
I mean, yes. And I think that one fascinating thing, I think, is the sorting across college majors, which is something that we can see sorting across colleges, but also across college majors. And we can see this explicitly in our data. It turns out that economics is kind of like pretty much in the middle, which when I tell economists makes them very happy that they're kind of, it's a discipline that doesn't necessarily lean so far one way or another. But certainly higher education leans to the left in our data. Certainly elite colleges lean to the left in our data. Certainly many academic disciplines lean to the left in our data. And so I guess for lack of a more sophisticated answer, if you're looking for a place with a good deal of partisan segregation, looking at universities is not a bad place to look.
But I mean, like the mechanisms, though, are interesting, right? Because you have this sort of self-sorting. You lean a lot on, people are choosing these sorts of majors that are kind of correlated with their partisan identities or may help shape their partisan identities. And then they choose workplaces and things like that and colleges and down the line, et cetera. But is there any impact that you can find on the employer side of selection? Like, I don't know if you're experiencing this at all too, but like there's some level to which, when you're in an interview, they're trying to suss out if you're a good fit for the company. And part of that fit, I assume, might be ideological or partisan.
I think that's absolutely right. And so I think that just isn't the main mechanism or the main channel that we study in this paper, honestly, because, we have to choose something. And so we focus on the worker side. Again, there's evidence, I think, from Brazil in particular. There's a paper looking at employer, you could call it discrimination. There are audit studies in the U.S. looking at callback rates for resumes that signal, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. And there's some evidence for that as well. So yes, I do think that kind of employer selection story is certainly part of what's going on.
Yeah. I think that like your focus on the employee side is actually really interesting because I think that like it raises questions about like allowing this kind of free choice, how that can lead to maybe societally suboptimal ends. Like there's a new paper in the American Political Science Review from John Green and several of his co-authors that looks at demand for echo chambers, and so like mostly we think about like echo chambers and we're like, oh man, like social media, it's like such an echo chamber. We're like talking about it as if it's kind of like imposed on us. And their intro of that paper has something interesting where they argue that networked curation processes lead information consumption on social media in particular to be more politically homogenous than the empirical literature has thus far suggested. However, this is more a reflection of democracy than a threat to democracy, a product of individuals engaging with information and each other on their own terms. Essentially, like people are choosing to follow certain people. They follow creators, they follow influencers, they follow their friends, they follow people that make them feel good about themselves. There's this big outrage. I don't know if you notice, like people were following the VP account on Instagram and then were like shocked to realize that like they were now following JD Vance and like there's like a mass like unfollowing happen or whatever. And it's like, like that's like you had curated your Instagram feed to be people you wanted to follow. And all of a sudden you see like JD Vance being, inaugurated on your feed and you're like, how did I get on here? Like what's going on? And, I think that's like, it's like an interesting question about whether or not, in previous generations, elections, people went and they bought a newspaper, and like you couldn't just choose to take the parts of the newspaper that you wanted. You had to take it all, and you don't do that anymore. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or like, should you want to change this? Are there even ways to change this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point and interesting question, right? Like, is partisan segregation bad? Should we be worried about it? I think is a very important and interesting question. I will note that, when labor economists study racial and gender segregation at work, they have a different set of motivations in mind. They have equity motivations in mind. These are protected categories. We really are worried if, in particular about differences in pay between groups doing the same work. Whereas I don't think we have the same equity motivations for being worried about Democrats and Republicans at different workplaces and whether they get paid.
Conservatives in the academy is a very controversial conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. So without going there, I think that we have different motivations to study partisan segregation at work versus these other forms of segregation. I think that, and this is kind of getting to, I think, a conversation that we had a little bit earlier. Like, it's probably good that people get to do what they want and put themselves in workplaces where they feel happy and, where the organization kind of aligns with their goals. It's probably good that, people work with coworkers who they get along with. It probably makes them, to some extent more productive. Does it make the actual firms more or less productive, I think, is an open question, and it's certainly one that factors into this calculus about whether we think this is ultimately helpful or harmful. And then, of course, the other, I think, really hard question to answer, which we talked about before, is what does this do for democracy generally? Should we sort of think of, it's bad that this place where we thought that partisans might be mixing more than in other environments actually isn't going to, provide that kind of mixing. Is that what are exactly the consequences of that lack of contact between people who don't think the same way? I think is a hard question to nail down. I think we have this intuitive sense that probably it's not so good if we really segregate ourselves politically, but actually quantifying or measuring and thinking about why, I think, what are the effects of that, I think is still an open question.
One note of hope I might relay here is that, I thought about this in the context of my job, which is obviously not the average job in the United States, but I come into contact in the context of my work with people who don't work here all the time. So, for instance, I might come into contact with people who I'm interviewing who are different than me when I'm walking down the street doing man-in-the-street interviews. But if I also conceptualize other jobs, like if you're in the service industry and you're a restaurant worker, maybe all your coworkers behind the bar are, on the same team as you, but you're serving customers and talking to them and interacting with them. And that may also lead to a lot of that cross-partisan contact in a way that, hopefully would is I think it's both difficult and almost both difficult and possible, maybe even, and undesirable from a business perspective to be able to even do that sorting. Obviously, at some level, businesses do this, right? If you're you have a rainbow flag in the window or something, you're signaling to people. But in general, most jobs force you to interact with people outside of your workplace, and that sorting may happen much less in that context. So you could think of your workplace as your home versus when you go outside and then you're okay, well, I'm interacting with people who are different than me, but I have a place to go back and dish with my coworkers about how rude they were.
Yeah. So I think that studying, the extent to which different occupations, I think, interact, with customers or with the public, and whether that sort of has some bearing on these kinds of effects on political views, I think would also be interesting. When they say the workplace is sort of a context for this kind of cross-cutting discourse, I think what they usually have in mind is with fellow coworkers, but certainly you're right that those aren't the only people that you interact with in the context of work, and so that would be super cool to study.
Well, that's a great place for, I think, our final question, which is, what is an idea that you once thought was a great one, but ended up only being good on paper?
So I thought about this a bit, and if you'll forgive me, I think I'm going to mention another academic paper, which is related, but not exactly the same. So one thing that I'm super interested in as someone who's interested in politics and demographics and data is the extent to which these demographic characteristics, some of which we've been talking about, are really predictive of politics and party affiliation, things like race and gender and age. And I think what is tempting then is to say, there are these strong correlations that exist between politics and demographics. We know something usually about demographic trends in the U.S., whether a particular racial group is growing, whether people are becoming more educated on average or not. And so using that to make predictions about what's going to happen to politics and to elections, I think is really tempting. This is the idea that, people are becoming more educated on average, and, more educated people tend to vote for Democrats, and so the Democrats are going to do better in the future. There are various versions of this, I think, argument, and it's quite tempting to make. But it turns out it doesn't really work. And so I think there's a paper by one of my advisors, Vincent Pons, as well as Jesse Shapiro and Richard Calvo, I believe, where they test this. So they look at the correlation between politics and demographics in a particular election. They say, if these correlations were the same in the next election, we sort of just tracked the evolution of demographics from election to election, how good would that prediction be? And it turns out that it's quite bad. It's sort of worse than just guessing that, it's going to be 50-50 Democrat or Republican. And I think that sort of goes to show that, it's kind of interesting that these demographic correlations are so strong in the moment, but also these trends are kind of slow moving, and politics responds kind of quickly, and parties respond to, where they see their electoral advantages. And so
demographics are not destiny. Are not
that
destiny.
I could have just said that, and I think I probably would have gotten the same point across, but
No.
This is a longer way of saying that point.
No, it's great. We'll put the papers in the show notes as well. But thank you so much, Sahil. This was fantastic.
Thanks for your time.
Good on Paper is produced by Rosie Hughes. It was edited by Dave Shaw, fact-checked by Enna Alvarado, and engineered by Erica Huang. Our theme music is composed by Rob Smirsiak. Claudine Abade is the executive producer of Atlantic Audio. Andrea Valdez is our managing editor. And hey, if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I'm Jerusalem Demsis, and we'll see you next week.